Okay, welcome back. In this video, which I've broadly categorized as protecting Indian status, we're going to be talking about the events of the 1960s that galvanized Indigenous activism in Canada and the separate legal rights granted to status Indians. Before we get into that, let's quickly clarify what Indian status is. So status Indians are wards of the Canadian government, and status has historically only included First Nations persons, not Inuit or Métis. Section 6 of the Indian Act defines criteria for who is legally considered an Indian. The Indian Act applies only to status Indians, thereby refusing non-status individuals the rights conferred under the Indian Act. An amendment in 1985 separated band membership from Indian status, thereby granting bands the right to develop their own membership codes. The way that Indian status has historically been granted is problematic, not only because it was very easy to lose status, a process called enfranchisement. For instance, if somebody with status earned a degree or a professional degree, university or professional degree, they would automatically lose their status, but also because it was extremely sexist. Under the 1867 Indian Act, an Indian was defined as, first, any male person of Indian blood reputed to belong to a particular band. Secondly, any child of such a person. And thirdly, any woman who is lawfully married to such a person. This obviously discriminated against status women who would be stripped of their status if they married a non-status man, because status was defined through patrilineal lines, meaning a woman's status was dependent on her father or her husband. For an example of how this impacted the lives of Indigenous women, let's consider Sandra Lovelace Nicholas, a Wolastoqey woman from the Tobic Reserve in northern New Brunswick. Lovelace Nicholas was appointed to the Canadian Senate in 2005. In 1970, Lovelace Nicholas married a non-Indigenous American, thereby losing her status. Even after her marriage ended and she returned to the reserve she grew up on, she was refused subsidized housing on reserve because she was no longer a registered Indian. She ended up for a time living in a tent. She was also refused health care on reserve and education for her children, in accordance with the Indian Act. In August of 1977, she joined a group of women who demanded an end to the Act's discrimination and occupied the Tobic Band office for about 4 months, which ended when the Band Council reluctantly permitted her to stay on reserve. In 1981, Lovelace Nicholas took her case to the United Nations Human Rights Committee, arguing that the Indian Act's gender-based discrimination violated international law, and the UN ruled in her favor. In 1985, Parliament responded to the appeals of Lovelace Nicholas and many others who brought similar cases by amending the Indian Act with Bill C-31. This amendment reinstated status to women who had lost it through marriage to non-status men, and enabled all first-generation children of these marriages or individuals who had become disenfranchised to regain their legal status. More than 114,000 people gained or regained Indian status as a result. This did not resolve all sex-based discriminations, but in November of 2017, the current federal government pledged to introduce further amendments to fully remove gender restrictions against women, although this is not yet passed into law. While Indian status as a legal category is undoubtedly problematic, it's still important. Status acknowledges the unique historical and constitutional relationship that Indigenous peoples have with the federal government and the Crown. For these reasons, attempts to abolish Indian status incurred widespread resistance. In 1969, in an effort to achieve socio-economic equality between First Nations and non-Indigenous Canadians, the federal government proposed to abolish Indian status altogether. This 1969 Statement of the Government of Canada on Indian Policy, known as the White Paper, was met with strong resistance and was considered a tool of cultural genocide. And I don't use that term lightly. If enacted, the White Paper would have terminated the separate rights granted to Indigenous peoples and encouraged assimilation. Indian status would have been eliminated, The Department of Indian Affairs would have been dissolved, and responsibility for Indian affairs would have been transferred to the federal government, from the federal government to the provincial governments. The Indian Act would have been abolished. Reserved lands would have been converted into private property that the bands or their members would have been able to sell to Indigenous or non-Indigenous buyers. The treaties would have been gradually terminated, and outstanding land claims would have been addressed. Funding would also have been provided for economic development. Those opposed to this measure asserted that, although status was a government imposition, Indian status acknowledged the distinctive history of Aboriginal peoples and the Canadian state, and forced the government to legally acknowledge their obligations to Indigenous peoples. By attempting to abolish Indian status, Pierre Trudeau's government sought to absolve the government's commitments to Indigenous peoples, did not respect First Nations sovereignty, and inferred that the eventual assimilation of Indigenous peoples into mainstream Canadian society was inevitable. The most notable response to the White Paper was the Indian Association of Alberta's response, called Citizens Plus. This title was drawn from a 1966 report commissioned by the federal government by anthropologist Harry B. Hawthorne, which looked into the social conditions faced by First Nations people in Canada in 1963. Hawthorne's report, called A Survey of the Contemporary Indians of Canada, Economic, Political, Educational Needs and Policies, concluded that Canada's First Nations peoples were the most marginalized and disadvantaged group among the Canadian public, or were citizens minus. Hawthorne's report proposed that all forced assimilation programs, including residential schools, which we'll talk about in the next video, should be abolished, and that Indigenous people should be seen as citizens plus, and should be given the opportunities and resources for self-determination. The Indian Association of Alberta's report, Citizens Plus, known as the Red Paper, referenced Hawthorne's recommendations. The Red Paper was written principally by Harold Cardinal, a Nahaya Cree writer, political leader, and professor. Cardinal's personal response to the White Paper, An Unjust Society, was a rejection of Trudeau's claim that Canada was a just society. The book became an immediate bestseller, and Cardinal's strong criticism of Canadian Indian policy became highly influential, especially among burgeoning Indigenous activists. Trudeau's government withdrew the White Paper after it received such strong and widespread criticism. Cardinal and other First Nations leaders gained momentum and had meetings with the federal cabinet in the 1970s. The strong response to the White Paper galvanized Indigenous activist movements, like the Red Power movement, which sought constitutional recognition for the rights of Indigenous peoples, including non-status Indians and Métis. Okay, I know that was brief, but that's where we're going to leave the White Paper, and make sure to bear this context in mind in our final video on land claims and Indigenous title.